as we know, tax havens often make the front page of newspapers because of the reliance on these jurisdictions by some taxpayers and corporations to avoid or evade tax. So who are these countries? Some lists have been published, and in the next session, young tax leaders and experts are going to discuss the objectives, the usefulness, and the effectiveness of such lists, namely for corporations, institutional investors, and governments. So to moderate this brainstorming session, we're very pleased to have with us today Mr. Harvey Cashore. Harvey is an investigative reporter over at the CBC. He is in charge of the weekly investigative program that we know as the Fifth Estate. He has worked on numerous stories that have uncovered government scandal, international fraud, and justice-related issues that have made headlines across the country. Harvey is also a recipient of the prestigious Best Television Documentary Award from the Canadian Association of Journalists and has twice been nominated for a Gemini Award. He is a frequent lecturer and teaches a seminar on investigative reporting for the CBC's training department. And we know that journalism is key to the health of our democracies. So we're very happy to have Harvey Cashore with us today. And if everyone is ready back there in the internet, I will pass it over to Harvey to lead the conversation with our guests.
Thank you for having me here today. I appreciate the invitation. I'll just, I guess it was maybe 10 or 12 years ago now that I first began my own sort of research into tax havens from a point of view of what do taxpayers care about, what do Canadians care about. And I got a tip to my email address saying, look into the KPMG offshore structure in the Isle of Man. And this is when we sort of first got our, where's the Isle of Man? I guess I knew it was off the coast of England. And we discovered there were these super companies set up of no real activity in which people were going to donate all of their income to people that didn't know, and they would call it gift. And then they would somehow miraculously get that money back through interest from other gift back and avoiding the tax. And so this got me into the whole world of offshore tax havens, which we don't care about as citizens, which is, are we all paying our fair share of tax? And then we, of course, the KPMG affair became a big news across Canada because it was revealed that the Canada Revenue Agency had figured out the scheme was in place and did a secret private deal with KPMG and the high net worth Canadians who were involved in the tax offshore scheme. And what they said was, as long as you pay the back taxes, there'll be no penalties, no criminal prosecution, and you'll just pay the back taxes. Oh, but there was one more clause, and that was, you can't tell Canadians you've offered you this deal. This deal is null and void if you talk to publicly about this deal. So, of course, we released a copy of that agreement by somebody who wanted Canadians to know there was a secret deal, and that led to the big financial inquiry in the KPMG. And so, just to get into our conversation today, this question of what's a listed tax haven or why we should list them is fascinating to me as a journalist, which is, what is the point of listing a tax haven and what does that mean to list a tax haven? And frankly, you know, I've been to Bermuda on one of my stories, and 400 years ago, Bermuda had turtles and birds and no people. And one of the questions I've always had was, why do people fly there to do business? What was the point? So let me introduce the participants today in our discussion. We have Chidozie Chekmudumango from the University of Auckland. We have Rasmus Corden Christensen from Copenhagen Business School. We have May Hen Smith, University de Cambridge, Cambridge University. We have Clara Martinez Toledano from the Paris School of Economics, the World Inequality Lab. We have LuckyStar Miyandazi from Oxford University. Chucks Okarikwe from the Law in Lagos, Nigeria. We have Miroslav Palansky with the Tax Justice Network in Prague. Natalia Pushkariva from the University de Urbino. Diego Quinones from Quinones Cruz Abogados. Sela Stashholm from the Copenhagen Business School, and Joy Waruguru Ndubai from the Institute for Austrian International Law in Vienna University. And also William Ross is here, and I think one more participant is joining us as well. And maybe I could just start with, if we can go around with William Ross perhaps. What is the purpose of identifying and listing a tax haven? You're muted. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Premièrement, je voudrais juste dire que je suis désolé, j'étais censé m'adresser en français à vous. Ça va être en anglais pour faciliter la...
First of all, to facilitate the conversation, I'm going to speak in English. I was going to speak in French.
TaxCOOP, so far, splendid discussions. Why lists? Because I think that citizens need clarity and be able to know what's really going on. A list, depending on who makes it and who uses it, that's also a question, has to benefit to the population in order to ask for their government to create laws accordingly to the values that they claim to hold high. So in this regard, I would just say that like it is a tool of transparency. It is not an end in itself, but it is a mean that can be used for this.
Okay. Is Mayhem Smith here? Mayhem Smith? Yes. Could you answer your thoughts?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, well, what is the purpose of identifying and listing a tax haven in the first place? What's the reason for it?
I think the OECD had it right originally to sort of call out harmful tax practices. But I think if most of us have looked at blacklists historically, they're sort of naming and shaming tools, and that just doesn't work anymore. So they may have had good intentions 20, 30 years ago, but I think it's changed. The game has changed, and the nature of work has changed. So I don't really think these lists are purposeful or useful anymore, actually. And I think TGN has done a pretty good job in trying to distinguish harmful tax practices and secrecy and all these other topics.
How has the game changed, would you say? How has it changed?
I don't think we're looking at places anymore. I think we're looking at organized groups, organized crime, economic crime, and the kind of financial intelligence that we gather from tax is not a standalone pillar anymore. I think it's a wide variety of other kinds of financial intelligence that we need. So I think tax as a silo, as an ivory tower, just doesn't work on its own anymore. And I think we were all seeing that with the digital economy and the way that the OECD is trying to address it with its pillars.
Interesting. LuckyStar Miyandazi?
Yep, here.
Yeah. What would you say was the purpose of identifying and listing tax havens, and is it still relevant to do so today?
Well, I'll just talk about it in the context of my work, and I've specifically done a paper in 2018 on this, on the EU and blacklisting or listing countries that are jurisdiction considered as blacklists. But it's part of efforts to fight against money laundering and financial crime, and also countering terrorist financing. And I think in that regard, the purpose might seem useful, but in my opinion, especially listing African countries, some African countries that have been surprisingly listed, like Namibia, we've seen Ethiopia, we've seen countries like Tunisia. So this is very surprising. Even Zimbabwe was once listed. And I think there's an unfairness towards it, and there's a lack of transparency, because if you look at some of the major tax havens, they're based more in the developed world, and it's unfair to developing countries because it usually ends up with some of the businesses pulling out, and it also ends up with countries being closed for business more when they already need more, some of this foreign direct investment. So those would be that would be my opinion on the listing.
Okay. Clara Martinez Toledano, your thoughts? Yeah.
Yes. So the original purpose was to inform the public society and all the all the agencies in society about the existence of these these tax havens. I think with time and with more research in the passing of years since the OECD first published this list in 1998, we have seen that there are other tools and other methods to combat tax evasion, avoidance, and money laundering. But I still think that the initial purpose was very useful, since after the publishing of this list, more attention was given by governments, international organizations, and researchers to these questions. But I agree that this is not enough, and that now we are have made a lot of progress, in implementing policies to tackle this, and not only at least that it's true that in many cases it's not clear which criteria are used.
Okay. Miroslav Palansky, the Tax Justice Network.
Yeah, hello. I share the view of many of the people who have shared their thoughts in that the list may have been relevant in the past, but maybe their time is now over. And this is for me, this is mainly due to the fact that the blacklists are usually done by political organizations of countries, and these would not obviously blacklist their own members. And something that has also been mentioned here, that their members are some of the major tax havens in the world. So until that is resolved with some an independent maybe commission that would create the blacklist based on harsh and objective criteria, until then I think they're not so useful anymore.
Chucks Oriakwe from Lala, Lagos, Nigeria. You're we can't hear you.
Thank you, Ali. My thoughts on this particular issue.
Sorry, we're having trouble hearing you.
Can you hear me better now?
Maybe you can get your mic fixed, and we'll go on to the next speaker for now. We can't hear you. Okay. Natalia Pushkariba.
Yes, thank you. Well, I agree with pretty much everyone that the initial purpose of the list was, of course, to increase transparency, but now we're very well aware of what's going on, at least a major part of what's going on. And I think, as LuckyStar said previously, the huge problem here is inequality, because some low-income countries are actually bearing the consequences of being listed as a tax haven, while some higher-income countries, like European jurisdictions, who are also undoubtedly involved in this, suffer significantly less. So it became this structural problem of increasing inequality. But yeah, then I guess we will come back to this discussion in future sessions, discussing different types of lists and who makes them and for what purpose. Thank you.
If I could just ask, as a journalist, how did it come to be that low-income countries were selected for the lists and not high-income countries? How is that? Natalia?
It's just something that happens. I mean, obviously some lists are made by EU or by the US, and EU is very reluctant to including European countries, obviously, because they're afraid that money will flow someone else for a reason, I believe. But they're not afraid to include Zambia or other African countries.
Yeah, I mean, we've done stories here recently in Canada where Canadian provinces are as secretive as other. We're not listed, or maybe we are listed. I don't know. But you asked that question: who makes those decisions, and where the powerful forces that are behind those decisions? Yeah. Diego Quinones from Quinones, Cruz, Abogados. Yeah, what are your thoughts?
Hi. Yeah, I just want to emphasize a little bit the role of conditionality coming in as a lawyer, but also political scientist. I see this as a conditionality device. So you have someone who creates the list and wants to alter third-party behavior, right? And that's altered by making access to more or less beneficial tax regimes conditional on tax haven not being part of the picture, part of the transaction, right? So when the users or consumers of tax havens reduce their interaction with these tax havens, the jurisdictions that were listed are pressured into adopting whatever measures the listing jurisdiction lays out as prerequisites for being either delisted or being listed in a temporary gray list, not the blacklist or the white list, right? So I do think conditionality is very important. And conditionality has worked for exchange of information for that purpose specifically. Is it enough? Probably not. We need more information on effective beneficiaries and other areas, not only financial flows, but it has been effective for exchange of information. Now, as to what the consequences are based on the relevant criteria, it's a huge political battleground. What makes a tax haven? It's not a univocal concept. Is it only the tax rates? Is it effective cooperation? Or is it actually tax harmonization? You actually want acceptance of things such as BEPS requirements. Do you want changes in your substantive economic requirements, ring fencing, etc.? So depending on how you define a tax haven, the effects are quite different in terms of what Natalia and Star are arguing about inequalities and other things. It really depends on how you define tax havens in the first place. If it's only exchange of information, it's fairly easy to agree on it. If it involves substantive tax harmonization, I'm not sure it's so easy to agree on, and I'm not sure it's ideal either.
Or just what about plain secrecy? What about that tax haven as a secret place to hide your identity about what you're really doing?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, you were asking earlier about jurisdictions which do not end up being listed, but which should be based on things such as their tax rates or their tax regimes, which are ring-fenced, but they're not secret necessarily, or vice versa. They have secrecy, but they don't have substantially low taxes. So you do need kind of to decide what is it that you're tackling, because they're not necessarily the same. You might have a high tax jurisdiction that does not transfer information effectively, or you might have a jurisdiction which transfers everything, but which at the same time maintains regimes that are not connected to economic substance. So I do think you need to, for starters, agree exactly on what it is that you want the list for. And it cannot only be exchange of information at this stage. I mean, Ney has already talked about the sort of substantive things that we want at this stage. That's kind of different.
Right. Well, let me ask, so Sela Stelshom from the Copenhagen Business School, in my work, I've often wondered, if one country is shamed into improving its standards, what prevents the consumer of offshore havens to go somewhere else? And I've seen this in my own work where, an offshore scheme will be identified in the Isle of Man, and then that person will be shut down, and they'll head off to St. Kitts. And so what is the point of a list if it means someone can just go shop somewhere else? Is Sela Stelsham here? No? Okay. Is Joy Waruguru Dubai here? Yeah, could you maybe answer that question, Joy, or expand on our previous questions?
Okay. I just, Diego was quite right in what he was saying, and I wanted to add that, listing is really a persuasive or a coercive tool, right? So it's one of many efforts to make competition more navigable for certain countries, which in this context has tended to be OECD countries. And if we understand the context in which some of these rules on transparency and, regulating secrecy, for instance, or exchange of information and et cetera, how they've emerged was really to respond to the needs of OECD countries. And that means that listing will obviously focus on non-OECD countries, of course, which of course raises questions about the validity of these lists. I like that you used Bermuda. Bermuda is an overseas British protectorate. So the first question you should really be asking is, where is London? Where is New York? Yeah, and they were some of the first to emerge as financial centers. So, the question really of how we are choosing to manage competition and whether that is a valid tool to manage competition is really something that should come quite strongly into focus now, because when we first had the harmful tax competition report in 1998, and then, preceding comments from Switzerland and Luxembourg, and then the US eventually saying, well, hold on, we don't want to talk about tax rates. We just want to talk about exchange of information. We just want to talk about the transparency challenges. That was a chance to address acceptable and unacceptable competition, and we did not take it. We're again at this point where we are trying to think about how do you manage competition? What is harmful competition? And it keeps changing, right? As so long as the concept of a tax haven is difficult to pin down, this concept of competition will continue to change as well.
Natalia, I see you nodding. Natalia? Did you want to add to that? I see you nodding.
Sorry, no. I just was enjoying what Joey was saying and agreeing with you completely.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe who we discussed this a bit, but who creates the list of tax havens and who should create the list of tax havens? Has somebody not spoken? Oh, Miriam Valet with the tax co-op. No. Who wants to answer that question? Who creates the list of tax havens? Chinozi, yeah.
Usually, the OECD has a list, a criteria of how to identify tax havens. There's a list, but the issue is there's an issue of legitimacy. Whether OECD, which is a group of about over 30 countries, whether they have the legitimacy to create a list. That's one issue. Also, researchers in economics also have a list of tax havens, and the OECD uses some criteria, like, for example, no income tax, no substantial activity, probably ring fencing, and no transparency, and no exchange of information. So now there's an issue of legitimacy and what is a tax haven. Due to the fact that there is subjectivity as to what is a tax haven, it's quite difficult to know, to have an accepted or a universally accepted list of tax havens. For example, you could have one list of tax havens by the OECD. You could have another list by economics. So it depends on how you view tax haven. And then again, if there's an emphasis on not having an income tax, what about where a state has what you call a DBCFT, that is destination-based cash flow tax? Assuming it still relies on a cash flow tax instead of an income tax, should that still be regarded as a tax haven? So it's quite highly subjective. Thank you.
Yeah, Star. Who uses a list of tax havens? Who wants to know, and who uses this list?
I think the list is widely used. It's used by international organizations, it's used by businesses, it's used by donors who want to invest in a country, so they want to go there and know what to expect in terms of, because, for example, the EU list has a 3-set criteria, which is on tax transparency, fair taxation, implementation of the anti-base erosion and profit shifting measures. And so these are very important lists. So I'll just use an example of a country like Tunisia. When Tunisia was listed in the blacklist by the EU, a lot of businesses started pulling out investments in Tunisia, because then your country is seen as not being transparent, it's seen as not being fair in terms of taxation, and most of all, it's seen as not implementing a lot of the BEPS measures that it should be implementing. So it's quite an effective tool when it comes to that. It's also used by campaign organizations. We've seen international organizations such as Tax Justice Network Africa use this list to also show the unfairness and inequality that exists. And in that regard, I want to disagree with Diego, because we already have a set criteria when we speak about tax havens and blacklists. And so we know exactly what we're talking about when you're talking about secrecy jurisdictions and how we categorize this. But to me, and in my opinion, is about who categorizes it. And when it's coming from an institution such as the European Union, and it's a list that's agreed on by the European Council, of course, it's going to exclude some of their member states. And this is why it took a year to negotiate negotiate a list that would not include British protectorates and would not include the Virgin Islands, Jersey, and I mean would include countries like Zimbabwe and Tunisia and Namibia. So it's quite an unequal balance of power shift that we're talking about here, beyond just talking about the legal setup of the list. It's also based on the Financial Action Task Force methodology, and these lists vary a lot. So you can see that depending on who makes the list and which institutions make the list, which countries will be listed.
Interesting. Diego, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I perfectly understand that each organization has its own criteria. And of course, the EU and the OECD have defined them, and international legislation does as well. The question is, does each national legislation want the same criteria? So, for example, in the case of Colombia, say, what we cared about mostly was to have an effective exchange of information with certain Caribbean islands and with Panama specifically. We did not necessarily care about tax rates. We did not necessarily care about tax base. So Flore as a tax haven was very much a concept of uncooperative jurisdictions in the sense of not being able to exchange information freely and effectively. So what I'm saying is that those criteria should change based on the interests of the person that wants that categorization. What is it that you want to identify these organizations for, or these jurisdictions? And certainly what the OECD wants, or what, say, France wants, might not necessarily be the same that Colombia wants. That's my point. It's political in that you define the criteria based on your own interests. And those are not necessarily cosmopolitan interests, if you will. They are subject to each country's preferences and their own relative positions.
Clara Martinez Toledano, any thoughts on this?
So, I mean, I know that an interesting discussion has started. So I think what we should be all caring about is whether these tax havens are good or bad, and which are the distributional consequences of this. So in that sense, I think, as I said, I think for me, or in my view, the list was useful in the beginning just to attract the importance of this. But I think now the focus should be to understand which are the consequences of these tax havens on inequality, which are the consequences of these tax havens for public revenue, for countries that are tax havens and countries that are not tax havens. So I don't think, I don't know, I think it's better not to enter, I understand the point, the point that, and I completely agree that the list should not be political. Of course, I think if there is ever a list, it should be completely independent of political, of politicians. But I think that even though this might harm as they were pointing out, that of course this harmed more low-income countries than rich countries, and I completely agree that this is the case. And I still don't understand why Luxembourg is still not included as a tax haven in some of the lists. I still think that the first purpose and the initial purpose was very important, because without that, I'm pretty sure that we would not have been able to make the progress that we have made. Yeah.
May, what are your thoughts on this discussion? Oh, your speaker though.
I'm actually kind of curious as to what people think the future of tax havens is going to look like. That's that I'm thinking about and thinking of working on. And since we have such an eminent group of scholars here, we've thought about the past and we're thinking about the present. But what do you all think about what the future might look like as a tax haven, as maybe a physical place, a type of economic structure? There's this quote by Timothy Mitchell, who's a political scientist, who says, capital may be fictitious, but the infrastructure is real. And he talks about highways and trains and waterways that transport things. And what might that look like visually or sort of conceptually for the rest of you in terms of, things that behave like a tax haven, but maybe are not a physical place?
Joy, do you have thoughts on that?
I wasn't planning to respond to that. Before I do, I just want to sort of roll back to something that was said There's a point I made initially where I said that the point of these lists is to make competition or the market, the global market on tax policy, more navigable for certain countries. So, there's a point that's kind of missing in this debate, and it's that no country is really obligated to implement any of the OECD standards, right? So how do you convince people that they need to consume these policies that are being developed in a very tight group of countries? And really the listing, the naming and shaming, as May you called it, is really part of the tool that can forward this agenda, that can push forward this agenda. But the other thing is the ability to impose sanctions. And that means that the implications of this are no longer just tax implications, they shift into the trade space. And we kind of saw this happen with the Panama and Argentina case, which, kind of happened in the trade policy at the WTO level. And the question was, can you implement these types of sanctions without having any implications for your trade obligations, which are obligations, right? Whereas the tax policy side is not quite an obligation, and imposing sanctions is also not an obligation. It's a decision that a country can make. I just wanted to throw this in that, the fact is we're talking about very soft law, and what are the implications of these lists when we're talking about soft law? I think Diego looks like he has something to say.
Yeah, Diego, yeah.
Well, no, I do think that they have tax and trade implications. Again, the case in question being Panama. Colombia struggled for many years to include Panama in our own list. You could say that formally and substantively all the criteria were met for Panama to be included. It was not included, and it was not included for many years because of trade issues. Because Colombia had a very strong position in terms of public procurement with Panama, and a lot of Colombian conglomerates had business there. There were threats voiced about the inclusion of Panama within a tax list. And we also had open cases before the WTO regarding dumping, and free trade areas, actually. So they do interlink. Certainly, I mean, with politics, everything interlinks. It's not only tax, like May said, it's perhaps not an ivory tower. So that's all what I had to say for that, yeah.
Miroslav, your thoughts on this debate?
Yeah, I think I might take on May's suggestion to talk about the future, and I think that the future is in changing the international tax system, as in the current one just doesn't work, and the future one needs to align economic activity of agents and companies with the taxation rights within those jurisdictions in which this activity is happening. So, I believe that is the way, and I believe a lot of our resources should go towards the goal, and perhaps currently they don't so much.
So, what are the other approaches then? If lists aren't going to be what's needed, what are other approaches? Yes, do you? Yeah.
I think that we're focusing a lot on the supply side of the equation, right? What to do about tax havens, but the other approaches are the demand side. Why are people using tax havens? And that's a huge area to work in. We need a lot of work to do in strengthening voluntary tax compliance. It should not be all about enforcement. It should be about voluntary tax compliance. We need to work on increasing trust with tax administrations, procedural justice, and, as Mirek was arguing, issues about distributive justice within the tax system are key. I mean, you need for people to feel that the tax system is legitimate, so that they do not feel compelled or pressed or pushed into using a tax haven as well, I'd say.
But what does that mean if people don't feel compelled to use a tax jurisdiction? They just don't want to pay more tax. How would they? What's another way of saying that wouldn't feel like they're just trying to avoid taxes?
I think that users of tax havens sometimes go to tax havens not only because they feel that the tax rates are higher in the residence jurisdictions or in the jurisdictions where they do business, but also because they don't see the system as legitimate or legitimate enough. And they're happy doing this because they don't have a nexus, they don't have a contract with the tax system at home that's strong enough. And that means that if you have an administration that makes you feel that you're being harassed if you don't agree with the content, the substantive content of how the tax burdens were distributed in your own country. It is likely that you choose tax havens as a resistance strategy, as a disengagement strategy. So that's part of the problem. It's not the problem for everyone. Of course, there's some rational takers that are only thinking about profit maximization, sure. But that's only part of the picture. There's other people that are reacting on other sociological, psychological bases here.
Well, speaking as a journalist, as a layperson in this conversation, are you saying really that if Amazon or an Apple doesn't like the tax rates in the country in which they work, they should be entitled to go to an offshore tax haven?
You're talking on the normative sphere. I'm not saying that they should or shouldn't. I'm talking on the descriptive sphere. Why is it that some do it? So certainly some do it because of these reasons. Should they do it? Of course not. I don't agree with tax resistance at all in that sense. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying that the menu of reasons that lead people to go to a tax haven are not exclusively pecuniary. They're not only about how much tax is to be paid, but about how connected you feel to your own tax system.
Okay. William, thoughts on this conversation?
Well, it's very interesting. There's a lot to say. I think that to try to bridge the question of the past and the future, I would have to I think we have to reframe that all of this in a history of colonization and decolonization of the Western world into Africa and the rest of the into America and Asia. The legislation of convenience that are fiscal havens are creations of the colonial model. And they the fact that the list that have been criticized today are the list of OECD or G20 country is also a form of culpabilizing countries that have been striped from their own autonomy politically and economically to be able to do whatever they want to do. So in this regard, I think that there's a doubling down on the negative effects of colonization here. So all in all, the question still remains, what can we do? And I think that something like the Tax Justice Network list is a very powerful tool for citizens around the world to be able to ask to their own government to raise the standards of transparency or of exchange of information between countries. So I think that these are still relevant issues, but the main problem becomes that as the Western world becomes more and more aware of tax havens, they also are inclined themselves to become tax havens. And so I would agree with May that the question would be, maybe it's not about territory anymore than just vast networks of where is the investments are going on. And these questions are really the one that we have to have in mind. And another huge problem that comes with that is also everything about cryptocurrencies and things like that, that can just become a new way of recreating the logistic behind fiscal havens, but without any trace on the legitimate tool that we have right now.
Chooks or Okariakwe, are you available to respond now, or are you there? No. Joey, any thoughts on this?
Yes. I'm just thinking about the future of what tax could look like if we continue as we are, and I'm thinking about the likelihood that we may push more of the disputes towards the more obligated spaces like trade or investment, right? And to me, what we need to think about is how we could begin to identify acceptable and unacceptable competitive practices in the same way that the trade space has done. And perhaps we also need to think about how to make this more of an obligation rather than a standard, but an obligation that's been developed with the considerations of all countries, right? So what I'm really pushing towards is let's start to talk about a more global tax body that provides fairer negotiating spaces for developing countries in particular. But the reason I talk about acceptable and unacceptable practices is we need to have very clear parameters that can be taken potentially to the dispute level if need be. So if you violate some of these rules, can you be challenged in any space? Because a list will remain a list so long as we continue in this direction.
Clara, any thoughts on this?
Yes, so I agree with Miroslav that, I mean, the future of tax havens for me, or the way to get rid of these practices that create a lot of inequalities is through taxation. So I strongly believe that if we would have a more progressive global taxation, these all the practices that we see in tax havens, such as tax avoidance, tax evasion, money laundering, etc., could be reduced. So in that sense, all the empirical evidence that we have points in the direction that the ones that benefit of tax havens are the wealthiest people across the 5 countries. So the wealthiest corporations, multinationals, and also the wealthiest individuals. And they do respond to these incentives. So all the evidence is not that I believe it, it's like all the empirical evidence has shown that these people react strongly to low tax rates. So by making the tax system a bit more uniform, I'm not saying that it has to be completely uniform. I'm just saying that by making it a bit more uniform, we could all share the pie better, and I do believe that this would have positive consequences for our welfare systems.
What about the argument that as you make tax systems more uniform, you're making them lower? It's what people call the race to the bottom. What about that concern that the standards just become lower and lower across the board?
Exactly. So are you asking to me, or are you asking to? Yeah. So again, the situation now, there has been some improvement, but the situation now is that we still are in the race to the bottom. But I do strongly believe in the race to the top. So I do believe that countries should not compete with lower tax rates, but they should compete with high education, with high innovation, etc., and with strong welfare systems. And that's why I think that another world is possible with a different tax system. I mean, I'm not saying that I have the solution for what the tax system should be, but I do believe that by implementing some sort of tax sanctions to places that have very, very or zero low tax rates and compensate home countries with this additional money, part of the problem that we see nowadays could be solved.
Yeah. Star, your thoughts?
My thoughts on this are more on the policy making side. So I see tax havens as an existence because there are loopholes that are there for people to take advantage of. And that's the whole argument of tax avoidance versus tax evasion. We're basically talking more or less about tax avoidance, which is not illegal. So for developing countries, mostly it's how to make the laws better to seal some of these loopholes. How are you dealing with how companies are reporting within their jurisdiction, and also now working internationally and cooperating I work on Europe and Africa. So how to cooperate with Europe to find out that companies are not reporting different benefits or different profits in Europe than they are making in African countries. So this is definitely something that would help in terms of sealing these loopholes. In terms of the whole tax agenda, I just wanted to say that tax is not only about, revenue collection. So we go to the 4 basics of tax. We're also talking about issues of redistribution, repricing, representation. And I think these are very important aspects of taxation that we should look at. I'm very passionate about the whole redistribution aspect of it at the national level, but also at the international level, which is the inequality that we are trying to get rid of. We're trying to get developing countries on the table to make laws that are tailor-made for their national context. We're trying to get developed countries to know that developing countries suffer differently when there's tax avoidance, when there's tax evasion, when tax havens exist. So I think in understanding this, then we can have greater international cooperation when it comes to the issue of taxation. But of course, that's a whole other criticism of organizations such as the OECD and the existence and representation of developing countries and what they actually get to do at that level and how it benefits them. But I think in terms of this discussion and talking specifically about tax havens, then this type of cooperation of understanding where developing countries are coming from and what the existence of tax havens means to them as a scapegoat exactly on taxes and what multinationals get to do there. And just maybe just to finish, to answer May's question about what tax havens will look like in the future, I think we're seeing now them narrowing down, but I don't see it now only being countries and bigger or smaller jurisdictions. It might even, we're talking about international financial centers, so we're talking about more capitals probably transitioning to become tax havens. So it might be a very grim future for the sector of tax havens.
Chidozie, your thoughts?
Well, I believe we have to look at it from the view of fiscal sovereignty. I think, considering the fact that these tax havens do make benefit from being tax havens, there is revenue. I believe they will continue to exist as tax havens. So the issue becomes, how do you now regulate these tax havens? And usually at the international context, when we talk about tax havens, we look at it from the issue of efficiency, from the perspective of neutrality. However, there's another part of efficiency in terms of the optimality part of efficiency. So now, is being a tax haven an optimal way of raising revenue for a state? That's an issue we should be asking. Being a tax haven, is there a way of ensuring global redistribution? That's another issue we should be asking ourselves. And if there are benefits of being a tax haven, can we really say that these tax havens will be eliminated? I do not think so. I believe countries will there will still be tax havens in the future. So I think we should focus on how to regulate these tax havens and bring them into the system, maybe through transparency or exchange of information. That's my perspective. Thank you.
William, any thoughts on that?
Maybe I would let my colleague Flore have a word.
Oh, Flora.
Hi there. I am from Échec au paradis fiscaux. I guess our colleagues were very busy organizing the session and they didn't have the time to let you know that we would be there.
Okay.
So I'll take a few minutes. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this question of official tax havens on official lists. And I think that corporations will use them as long as they're allowed to. Right now, it is mentioned that maybe the only solution would be the unitary tax, whereby a big corporation would have just one financial statement for the world with a fixed taxation rate, and then we would tax it across the world and divide the profits, not only between the shareholders in a specific country, but to the countries where the money was made. And I must say that in Échec au paradis fiscaux, we very often we have different opinions, and we wonder and we debate about whether or not lists of tax havens are useful. Sometimes we think that they contribute to legitimize other countries, which are really accommodating for corporations. And we see that it never stops. We sign agreements, we identify countries, and then the tax avoidance and the tax evasion keep growing. For instance, you probably know Canadians for Tax Fairness.
Yes.
Our colleague estimated that now Canadian corporations have accumulated nearly $400 billion investments in their 12 favorite tax havens.
Mhm.
And it's the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, estimates between $500 billion and $600 billion the revenues that are escaping the countries. So these lists do not work.
Well, let me ask more about that, because years ago I did a story on Paul Martin, our former prime minister, who had used Vanuatu to fly his ships.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if Vanuatu is on the list or not now, but I guess the question would be what you're saying, which is, does in some ways a list legitimize the kinds of problems we're trying to solve in the first place?
Yeah, you have, and maybe in this sense I will be agreeing with Mr. Basset from La Caisse de Dépôt. We have this list of bad guys, right? Bad countries. And then there are all the other countries with various loopholes and welcoming measures for other countries. So if we focus on the bad guys, the corporations will go to other countries. And in Canada, we have signed many agreements to share information with countries, many of them in the Caribbean, and then they become like perfect countries. And we know that in some cases the rates of taxation are near zero, and this is where Canadian money flows. I mean, it's a real problem. So yeah, we can have lists of the worst people, but this is not a solution. And we can always wonder why investors' money would need a transfer country between them, between the investor and the country of investments.
Right.
Why would they go through a third country if not for tax avoidance?
Right. And I think for those of us on the, journalistic side of looking at these issues, that's the basic question we would have, which is, and that's goes to the physical aspect of the question, which is, you've got an island in the middle of nowhere, and why is that even in the economic equation? What is the usefulness of that? And maybe it's no longer a physical issue. Maybe it's having a third party that has no business relationship to the transaction. What is the purpose of that?
Very often they invest in a mailbox.
Mm-hmm.
It's the only activity that they have in these countries.
Mm-hmm.
They have a mailbox. So, and this is where they pay their taxes. So when they bring back the profits to Canada, it will not be imposed. It will not be taxed because it has already been taxed in that country.
So I was in Bermuda and I went to the post office, and I don't know if you've ever, and it's all mailboxes, just as far as there's nooks and crannies, and it's never ending. And it's just these are corporations that hold maybe hundreds of millions of dollars, and they're just all silver boxes with keys.
Yeah. So you've seen that physically.
Yeah. Physically, I've been there and filmed it. Yeah. Yeah. But maybe we can throw this to others as well, which is, we're asking a very simple question now, which is something that, and it's a physical question, but what is the legitimacy behind having any tax haven in which there's no economic substance to the transaction?
Yeah.
Any thoughts on anybody else on that?
I would, maybe I will be a bit rough, and I haven't had the time to think it diplomatically, especially in English. But I guess, corporations have good friends in governments who understand that they need to be competitive at the international level. this is what they will have, governments will say, we have to be flexible because our corporations need to be competitive at the international level. So they try to make all kinds of agreements, but honestly, things are not moving at all. We keep speaking of various agreements, and OECD work is promising, but it's moving very slow, and it's not concerned with all the countries in the world. I look at all my colleagues here on the screen, and the majority of countries in the world have no say in the OECD decision. So we still have a lot of work to do, and I'm glad to see all these young people getting involved. So I will let other people speak now.
No, and thank you, and sorry for not getting to you earlier. I apologize for that. Yeah.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah. May, do you have any thoughts on this? Is it all doom and gloom, or is there no optimism for the future of handling these issues that are confronting?
So I guess I could give a little background. I actually used to be a tax collector for Canada Revenue Agency for about 4 or 5 years. Okay. And then I quit because I got really frustrated because half of our time was spent writing off uncollectible tax debt. And so at the time, it was around the financial crisis, I decided to leave and start a master's and then a PhD to study what I thought would be the ultimate tax haven. And so I've been studying the last 10 years, the role of offshore financial centers. Mm-hmm. And I've actually spent quite a few years in the Cayman Islands, which is what I did my PhD on, is how does an offshore financial center operate based on the experiences of the professionals who actually live and work there. So I spent a lot of years actually interviewing these lawyers and these accountants and financial professionals in the Cayman Islands and asked them, what's happening on a day-to-day basis, and how's the future of your center going to change and adapt as OECD rules and FATCA rules and all these other rules are changing. And really it's business as usual. And what you're seeing in Caribbean offshore financial centers based on my research is that they're specializing. And so if you guys look at historian works on Vanessa Ogle and Peter James Hudson are both really good historians who've actually written books on Barclays and how Barclays established itself in the British West Indies and all these things, you'll see that history kind of repeats itself in that these onshore jurisdictions have regulatory problems onshore. They go offshore to test and try these new financial products and services. And the ones that are successful or profitable actually end up repatriating themselves back onshore. And it's just, banking and tax. Those are only two things. But actually what you're seeing is that these offshore centers are specializing. Some centers like Bermuda are very good with reinsurance. That's what Bermuda is known for. Reinsurance is the insurance that insurance companies buy in case they have, 2 major natural disasters that they've got to pay for, like hurricanes, for example. Cayman's very well known for hedge funds, which means a lot of Canadian pensions and sovereign wealth funds are domiciled in the Cayman Islands. British Virgin Islands, for example, are very well known for Russian and Chinese companies' registries because not purely for illicit reasons. Some of it is actually so that they can access U.S. markets in order to take part in stock trading and stuff. So there are these tax havens that we label them as that are used for both pretty practical purposes that are just based on regulatory problems that we impose from Canada, the US, and the UK. So I think the conversation really needs to shift in terms of thinking about the role of these centers that are not just centers for tax, but actually much more. And I think tax is just the very tip of the iceberg. And if we're curious, and I hope we all are, that we'll actually think about tax as a suite of tools that these corporations use, and that actually it's tangentially beneficial for them to have a tax advantage, but actually there's a whole sort of iceberg of other things that they're actually using offshore for. And if we keep fixating on tax, we're going to lose the next iteration of what these financial centers are used for, and it's not just tax. While it's really important, I think we need to consider bundles from here on, especially as we think about the future of work in digital economies. There are a lot of things that BEPS, for example, and the new pillars are sort of trying to incorporate, and we kind of see slivers of that. So I hope what our tax scholars of the future will do is that they'll start talking to economic geographers, political scientists, people in other fields who are maybe not interested in tax, but actually interested in the economic movements of other things, and to think about tax in relation to what they're doing.
Interesting. Clara, your thoughts on this?
No, I mean, I agree. I put an emphasis on tax because from the empirical evidence we have, I'm a researcher at the World Inequality Lab, and my work mostly relies on using tax data and look at how people behave or respond to changes in taxes. And what I find in my research, and other scholars have found, is that taxes are like a very important margin to which people react. And we see that the tax havens, the ones that benefit the most from tax havens are rich people. And that's why I think that if we want at least to reduce within countries inequalities, both in low income countries and in rich countries, in high income countries as well, tackling tax havens will be beneficial, just because we see that at the top of the distribution in every country is the one that is benefiting from that. But I agree that there is a lot to learn by interacting with political scientists, economic geographers, etc. So I think I'm not saying that we should only focus on tax, but I do think that it's a powerful tool to at least in the short to medium run take a bit of control of the situation, and not letting globalization run like that for 50 more years.
Any more thoughts from any of our speakers here today before we wrap this up? Any more thoughts? Okay, I think we've got a bit over time here, so I just wanted to thank all of you, and thank you for having me. I've learned a lot today, and to participate in this really important topic. And as somebody who's been to some of these tax havens and seen it from a tax perspective, this conversation around the other issues that are as important to issues of global equity and who decides what a tax haven is, and we're hearing today that it's often the powerful and the wealthy nations that are determining the policies that are in place for all of us and for the global environment. And it's been really educational to hear all the perspectives here today. So thank you very much for having me moderate, and I appreciate when I go out into the world as a journalist on exploring tax havens tomorrow, I'll take what you've been speaking today and take it with me. So appreciate it. Thank you.